Awesome. Hey everyone, today is Tuesday, August 1st, 2023. This is a meeting of the SIG Network Policy API subgroup to SIG Network. This is a CNCF sponsored meeting, so please follow their protocols, be nice to each other, and keep the language G-rated. Thanks so much for coming today. We don't have a super packed agenda, so as we're talking, feel free to add stuff. There are quite a few new faces here. I'm not going to go through everyone individually, but definitely will open the floor for folks to kind of give a quick intro if they like, if they've never been here before, and just say why you're here, or maybe what you're interested in working on around network policy. So I'll open the floor. I'm not looking through everyone, so feel free. Going once. Oh, Boaz, you want to go?
Yeah, I tried to join this team, but timing was challenging. So I'm a product manager for StackRox, or what Red Hat calls Advanced Cluster Security, ACS. And specifically, we're doing some interesting stuff with network policies. One of the topics of most interest was admin network policy, or the lack of. And once we found out that this group is working on admin network policy, it really makes a ton of sense. It's a super critical requirement, we believe, for people whose job it is to write network policies. So that's kind of my focus on this area. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for all your great work.
Sweet, yeah, super happy to have you here. It's great to hear that there's some need downstream, so we're all excited to hear that, I'm sure. Okay, anyone else? Going once, going twice. Sold. Okay, let's go ahead and get started today. As I said before, feel free to add to the agenda while I'm talking. I posted a link in our Slack. I'll go ahead and or in our message queue, I will go ahead and share my screen. Let's see, share the right one. Let's see, I don't have to see my embarrassing number of tabs. Okay, first thing on the agenda is something we've been talking about a little bit. Well, actually, no, Surya, this is something new, I think. What is this? Oh yeah, Surya, do you want to kind of spearhead this? Is Surya here? Yeah, Surya's here. Or not. Surya, can you hear me? Maybe you're muted.
Hey, yep. Sorry for joining late. Can you hear me?
Yeah, no problem. I was just going over your first item on the agenda regarding status fields. So do you want to kind of go into, so this PR has been open for a while. It's a PR to print status as part of like the shorthand kubectl get ANP, right?
Yeah. So yeah, let me backtrack a bit into. So yeah, the reason why I added this PR to the agenda in general was for all of us to talk a little bit about how we define status in our API. And I know that the history of the spec says that we are intentionally less specific, right? Like we are generic in terms of how we define our status to be just a list of conditions, and that is intentional so that every implementation can just go ahead and implement that condition specifically according to what that is, right? Like whether it's for Entry or Cilium or OV and Kubernetes. So, I mean, I get that part, but at the end of the day, a status today is a list of conditions. So if I want to really make one of those conditions available on the shorthand version, there is
Mhm.
no way to specify that, right? Like maybe it's based on the timestamp, or maybe it's going to be the 0th index in that list of conditions. But to me, it seems like it can be really useful to have a unified set of, like, one set of condition that all the implementations agree, which could be as simple as a true or false thing for a ready or not ready kind of a thing for each of the CRD, which then can be exposed uniformly in the shorthand. Like the problem I'm having with the KubeBuilder syntax for shorthand is the way we write it today, it might just print the first condition, or maybe even the latest condition in the out of the list, right? So it's a bit not nice, let's say, to not have control
So,
over that.
so is it two separate problems? One being it would be really nice to have standard condition types and messages, etc., as built into our API, and another being KubeBuilder doesn't provide an easy way to view just the most recent status or most recent condition in a list of conditions. Are those two separate problems, or are you kind of lumping them all together here?
Yeah, I think they're two separate problems, but related. Because so if I want to, let's say I have two different condition types that I define for my implementation, and I want to be able to put one of those condition types in my shorthand, I have to
Mhm.
come upstream and implement that, right? Like, but there is no type that we define that is uniform across all implementations upstream. So if I do anything in KubeBuilder today upstream to the status that I've done in this PR, it's going to be useless. Like, so that's the part where the second part comes in, where we probably want to define at least one unified type that all implementations can then chew on, which would be like the one that gets printed in the shorthand.
Right. Mhm. That one, I think, I mean, I think it's totally possible. I feel like at the end of the day, when we first implemented status for AMP, the understanding was that we would kind of eventually conform on a set of statuses, or at least a set of shared status condition properties. I still don't really see how we're going to solve the shorthand notation. Like this could,
Because
this
if I
notation,
define the type, right? Like, so let's say that
yeah.
we have a type that says admin policy ready. In that case, I can come to the KubeBuilder, and in my shorthand, the additional printer columns that you see there in the JSON path, I can just say, I want to print that specific type of status in my shorthand.
Oh, okay.
Couldn't we just say we won't have any conditions in the kubectl output for now, and if we standardize on things later, then we can add it then?
Yeah, I guess that's also, like, I think today we don't, right? Like today we don't really give anything in the kubectl.
Nope, not in shorthand. And that was kind of, I think, one of my first comments on here was, I mean, you can essentially for now do the same thing with JSON path, right? Or most of the same logic. Like it would be more complex if you were matching on a specific condition type. But you should be able to do the same thing. So I think Dan has a good point, right? Okay.
But Dan, if we were to design that thing, right? Like, can we? I was thinking if we can do the design now, right? Like for the API, if it makes sense to actually add something to the status, or.
But I mean, you know, if we knew what statuses we wanted, we would already have added them, right? Or, you know, I assumed the idea was that we would figure it out once we had implementations or something. I don't know. I'm not quite sure what we would have, because we kind of agreed with the network policy status that there was no good way to make it work.
Yeah. Nadia, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to add also, based on the network policy experience of the status, that actually if we define that condition, we need to probably all agree what exactly that means, right? For like every implementation. And I think being ready may mean different things in different implementations. Like as, for example, some of them may only consider the policies ready when all the existing pods are updated like as peers or subjects, right? And then the other one is maybe similar to the network policy one, which is I could parse the network policy spec, so to say, or I've seen it, right? So there are multiple definitions or actually statuses that plugins may want to expose or actually be able to expose. If they are very distributed, they may never be able to set this status ready in a centralized manner, so to say.
Yeah. Jan, do you implement status for Andrea?
Yes, I think for Andrea policies we actually do. And to my knowledge, it does have something to do with data path realization. So so I think the if we do wanted to have some sort of like unified status thing, it, to me, it should definitely mean something like if a status is reported as completed or succeeded or whatever, it should mean that the network policy has been taken into effect, and every traffic regulated by that network policy will hit that network policy, basically. And that's my opinion on this. I don't know if it's sort of like doable for all implementations for the admin network policy. As Nadia said, it maybe it's a little bit challenging for them to have it centralized, but for Andrea we do. We for admin network policy we haven't actually implemented this yet, but I think it should be pretty straightforward for us as well.
Do you think, Yang, I look at it this way, it's kind of two steps, right? Like, I think the one thing we could coalesce on upstream is a set of standard types, like literally not like set statuses, but a set of standard types that an implementation can report, whereas like message, reason, status, all the other standard condition fields can be left up to the implementation. I'm pretty sure that's what Gateway API does. Not saying we're ready to do that yet, but I feel like that's what we would end up doing one day, and make it so that we can add new types if needed.
Okay, so the standard types you have in mind will be something like admin network policy ready, or is just that one condition that
it could be generic across our whole API, right? Like we could say you could, or it could be specific to each object, right? Admin network policy ready, admin network policy processing, et cetera, or it could be resource creating, resource reconciling, resource finished. You know what I mean?
yeah, okay, yeah.
I don't think it's something we're going to figure out right now, Surya, although I see your point. But I think for the meantime, I'm fairly certain you can implement the same thing you're looking for from a user perspective with JQ and JSON paths, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I also think that there might be something that even though we have a list of statuses, obviously, but there might be some logic we can implement underneath so that it sort of like solidifies all of them to a single one. Because look at pods, right? Because pods has the same thing. It has a bunch of status conditions like containers ready, pod scheduled on the node or whatever. But by the end of the day, if you do kubectl get pod, there's only going to be one status, which is going to be pending or running or something. They might have sort of already figured out something underneath so that it looks at all the list of conditions and say, well, if I were to just display one status on the kubectl get, what it will be, right? So, this is something that we can also go for, maybe, so that usually people definitely don't want to see a list of status conditions. They don't care about the history. They just care about what's the latest status. So but I don't know how that particularly is implemented. I'm just thinking out loud here.
Go ahead, Nadia.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it may be a bit more difficult for network policies and admin network policies to define like what every status means, because if even based on the definition Yang just gave, right, network policy may never become ready, so to say. Let's say like you create a new pod, peer pod, and it's not yet handled by all the network policies that select it as peer, should it go unready or not, because it's not at the moment is actually applied to all the pods it should select, right? So that's a long discussion, I guess, that we had a similar one around network policy status, and that's also probably why we don't have the predefined conditions yet.
Right. That was our whole rationale at the beginning, because like we've talked in circles in this group about either first it was network policy status, which got implemented as a KEP, no one used it, got back out, and now with admin network policy. So it was always like, let's allow CNIs to do whatever they want, right? And then hopefully down the line we'll see what a couple implementations are doing, and maybe there's some overlap, maybe there's not. You know what I mean? Reporting a centralized status for something like admin network policy is hard because you're having to report, a data plane object that's high influx. So I don't know what the best way to do it is.
Yeah, maybe actually in this condition, we could, if we don't set the message, I don't know if that's possible for a predefined type. So let's say we have one type that will be called a single admin network policy status, and then every implementation defines what exactly it means, but we can display that as a single current status. And then you can say, you can set it or not set it, but what exactly that means will be reflected in the message, and then different CNIs may define it differently.
What if we take this PR that Surya has already done, possibly shelf it for now, but open an NPEP out of it, and we can just like continue discussion there rather than doing it here. Does that sound good?
Yeah, I think that works. I agree that this PR is definitely not in a state for merge, right? Because it's useless. Like even if we do the JSON path right now, I don't know what value it can give to the users because it depends from implementation to implementation. So let's do it the right way, and let's not hurry it up like all of them said. So maybe we take our time and we do it the NPEP way. I'll try to see if I can capture everything we discussed today into an NPEP. Then we can talk on that.
Yeah, that works great. And maybe I was trying to think maybe we should add a note somewhere that says, we know folks are wanting to report status for now. JQ is the best way to do it, kind of in one line, but I don't think we need to do that. I think an NPEP is all right. Sweet. Thanks, Surya. Yeah, no, this is important. And like, we've never really figured out how to do this properly. So if we can document it in an NPEP, I think we can come to some sort of conclusion, and that'll be it, right? Hopefully we can figure out how to do statuses for any and all objects we create. Cool. I'll leave that open for now. Surya, whenever you get around to it, you can feel free to close.
Yeah, sounds good.
Cool. Any more questions, comments around statuses that we want to bring up here? Seems like next action item is just to get an NPEP, so you can stay tuned there. Cool, we'll move on. This is an NPEP we've been talking about for quite some time. It's been through a few review cycles beforehand from Dan and Yang. My goal is to get it merged this week. So it's kind of like a final call for reviews. I don't think I have much to say about it here because we've already talked about it quite a bit. Do you want to say anything, Surya, or did I cover it?
Yeah, I think this is good. I can see some reviews from Rahul and Andrew, which I will try to address ASAP. I did change it to meet the NPEP documentation requirements. So I'm hoping the format looks better now. Also, one thing that I wanted to bring up was, oh yes, we spoke a little bit about it in the last upstream meeting around
Mhm.
the differentiation between traffic towards a node and traffic towards a host network pod. It's again one of those, we have spoken about it
Right.
a lot in cycles thing, but I want to point out here, and Nadia raised a great point here, right? Like there's 3 distinct cases that we can run into, right? Like one of them is the traffic towards a node can be selected using a node selector. And a node
Correct.
object in Kubernetes is the entire object. So it means it includes the host network pods on the node.
Yep.
That's one case. The second case is where we have the host network pod selector, which will be an experimental flag that I plan to add because maybe CNIs cannot differentiate between a node traffic and a host network traffic, which is fine. They don't have to implement that label. But a host network pod selector is, as the name implies, traffic towards a host network pod alone that is matched by that selector and not the entire node, right? But there is a third case, which I had never even thought about, and thanks, Nadia, for bringing it up, which is a node selector excluding host network pods, right? Like if that's a case anybody wants, that's not something I'm considering in this NPEP, and I'm outlining it as a non-goal. And I want to make sure we're clear on that. There's no use cases there where people really want, yeah, I want to select node traffic that excludes host network pods on the node, right? Like that sounds absurd, but just saying.
I
Go ahead,
actually thought
Nadia.
on that, and I think we can. So we do have priorities now, right? So if you want something to apply to node traffic only, but not host network pods, in case you have host network pods implemented, you can just set a host network pod selector with a higher priority and say what it needs to do. Then everything that just falls through, right, will get to the node selector, which will not match host network pod. So I think maybe we can just say it in under known goals as like one way to work around that case, so to say. I think that should be enough, even if someone wants to do that for some reason.
Yeah, I think there should be different ways to express this, and they allow in a way that mark the element of what users want. But just from the selector perspective, this is how I kind of plan on a high level, right? Just so if any of you have concerns on it, just do feel free to comment on the NPEP. But yeah, Andrew, +1 to you. I do not want to prolong the NPEP too long because it has been open for a long time.
Yeah, no, totally. That third case you're talking about, to me, seems like you would solve it with a narrow rule. And I think we're getting a little bit into, I think by implicitness, like based on the user stories we've already defined, like Nadia said, like we already should be able to express, allow traffic to a node, but don't allow to host network pods. It might just not look like that in YAML, right? It might look like only allow traffic to, I don't know, port 880 on the host, right? And then there might be other ports being used by host network pods. Does that make sense? Like, I don't know if you need to specify it here. I think it's an additive property of those two user stories. The first 2 cases you kind of mentioned. Is that kind of right, Nadia?
Yeah, I think that's correct, but I think it's also good to mention that in known goals, right? When you say, okay, there is all kinds of traffic with node selector, then we also have a separate use case for a subset of it, which is host network pods. Then you kind of ask, okay, what's with the left part of it, which is node only traffic, and then we say, yeah, we are not going to consider it in this case. And
I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
We're going to catch, in my opinion, we're going to catch 99% of use cases anyway with those two, right? Node and host network, right? And it's already going a fairly further step forward than network policy, which never really touched host network pods. So should be interesting for sure.
If I may,
Andrew, yeah.
This is Blaž, Google. I just wanted to bring up another use case that I don't see listed. For us recently, multi-cluster came up as another use case. So the scenario is a namespace in cluster A and namespace in cluster B, and being able to control traffic between those two namespaces in different clusters.
Okay. Sweet. So in my opinion, admin network policy has been designed, spec'd and implemented in reference to one cluster. As it pertains to multiple clusters, I think that's going to require a different NPEP that maybe presents even a new object. Like, I don't know if we're ready to tackle the multi-cluster question just now in admin network policy, but it's really good to know that folks are looking for that, right? I think before people have asked for kind of like a multi-cluster network policy, or I don't know, we'd have to think about a name. So yeah, do other folks agree?
I just wanted to ask if you want to use CIDRs to actually select other clusters namespaces.
I don't think CIDRs are gonna be something that we could use. So it's possible to identify the cluster itself based on the CIDR, but I'm not sure that namespaces would necessarily be identifiable like that. So one possible idea was that namespaces are synced between the clusters. So namespace one, it means the same thing as namespace, in two clusters. Now, exactly how this would work is, a good question, and I think it's also a question of how do you actually specify a different cluster based on IP address, or CIDR, as you said, is one way, or there could be other identifiers. But yeah, it's possible that admin network policy is not the best place for this. I just wanted to raise it just to keep this story in mind.
We got a bunch of hands up.
Yeah.
I think Raul was first. Sorry, or Raul, were you talking about this conversation specifically, or were you talking about something else?
I was gonna bring up something else related to the egress NPEP. So we can swing back to me after.
Okay, who was next? I think Surya was next.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting use case of multi-cluster network policies. My question was, if namespace B means the same thing in cluster 1 and cluster 2, then that's just east-west traffic. It's an implementation detail on how the cluster-to-cluster networking is set up and how the policy itself is implemented. But as far as selection goes, it's a namespace selector at the end of the day. So I think that's already.
It's not as simple as that, because in Entrail we do have some, multi-cluster network policy. I think the problem is that when you define a policy object, it's still going to be in a single cluster. Now, when your subject says that I want to select namespace X, right? It usually means that I wanted to select namespace X in this particular cluster. But, people who apply this network policy might be in the mind of thinking, well, am I applying this only to the namespace X of my cluster, or it's all namespace X across the clusters? In that particular case, you will sort of like find a way to propagate this policy across all the cluster in a cluster set, right? So that's a different story. Now, in a peer, you might have a point that, if I select namespace B as a peer, and since all the clusters has a namespace B maybe, and those shouldn't mean the same thing, now the policy might need to be natively multi-cluster aware. But in terms of subject, that's a totally different story. I think in normal senses, you would need to apply a policy in each of the clusters for the policy to work. Well, that's definitely under the assumption that we still use the admin network policy object, and as Andrew has suggested, maybe for the multi-cluster use cases, another CRD might make more sense in that scenario.
Yeah, that's something also. Yeah, that makes great sense, Jan. Thanks for bringing that up. But I do think that for as far as the subject is concerned, it's like you said, like the scope of our current CRD is cluster scoped. If we want to make it multi-cluster scoped, then we need a new scope.
So yeah, that's a very. I think we did a long roundabout answer to your question. And just to circle it back, like we haven't thought a lot about multi-cluster use cases in this group yet, but we're eager to explore them. We just need folks to kind of come in and help spearhead it because we're definitely limited on cycles. So that being said, I think we'll move the discussion on unless there's anything else. I know Boaz had his hand up. Did you have anything to say to this effect?
I think other folks addressed it. Thanks.
Cool. Does that sound good?
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Cool. But I'm going to keep it in mind. The one other thing to think about too with those sort of APIs is no longer are our downstream consumers only going to be CNIs, right? Like in a lot of cases, there's multi-cluster network plugins. And so now you'd be looking at an API that's implemented across a couple of different entities. So just keep that in mind. Like we're going to end up with APIs like that most likely, especially with multi-cluster and even possibly like gateway API implementations. But it's definitely going to get a bit more complicated. A good point of reference to how some of these problems were solved is the MCS API, multi-cluster services API, that's part of another in-tree SIG. They kind of address namespace sameness and stuff like that. So if you're interested at all in these use cases, I highly recommend going and reading their existing KEPs and going to some of their meetings because they have answered a lot of these questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And I'll try and find the links to that after this meeting for the MCS stuff. I don't have it handy right now, but I'll link it in our agenda. Sweet. Okay, Raul, all the way back around to you on the egress cap.
Yeah, I made this comment in the I added it as a comment to the NPEP, but I wanted to bring it up in the discussion as well. I'm pitching my favorite use case, which is FQDN selectors for egress. I think this is as good a time as any to add them as a user story. I think we've established that they're pretty widely used in most CNIs. Like most CNIs have some flavor of this in their own network policy CRD. So broadly speaking, I don't think it's unimplementable. Obviously, the details will have to be ironed out so that everyone's happy. But yeah, I'm just curious if people have any concerns, thoughts.
I'll let Nadia go first. She raised her hand right away.
Yeah, I do have some thoughts about that because I actually was going to implement a separate NPEP for that. That's a big topic for a discussion. So, and that's like a new type of a peer that, yeah, will make sense generally speaking, but it may overload the existing NPEP, I think. So yeah, I have a plan to open a new NPEP for that soon. And there is a history of discussion around FQDN based rules for network policies also. I will link, there are lots of links and discussions that happened before, so I'll need some time to compile it all. But
Nadia,
I think also
most of those links are from Raul trying to push this forward. Like he was the one like way back when. So I think what would be awesome is I'm totally open to another NPEP. Maybe you and Raul can kind of work together on it, even be co-authors on it, however you want to do it. Does that sound all right, Raul? Because I'm a full +1 to that.
Yeah, I don't mind that. I'm just curious what the boundaries of this one are. Like this says support for egress traffic control. So I was thinking that this makes sense as a addition to the NPEP, but we can make it more granular, I guess, a specific type of egress control. That's fine too.
Yeah, that definitely falls in the general scope, right, of egress traffic but just
Right.
knowing that it will include lots of discussions just around
Oh, yeah.
FQDNs.
Yeah,
I think it
absolutely.
makes sense to have a separate one. And I'll definitely reach out to you. I think I've read some of the documents you created before, and hopefully now we have some more questions and examples actually of how this feature is implemented by different companies, so we can actually make the next step and see.
Yeah.
So we actually saw, Raul, I had just seen that Google's FQDN policy got released. I'm sure you were working on that, right? Because I
Yeah,
sent that
yeah.
link to Nadia and I was like, oh, we should do this in upstream. So congrats on that, first of all.
Thank you.
Second of all, I agree that it totally fits in with this use case, but we've made the NPEP process super lightweight. So if we can have multiple small NPEPs, I think it's going to work better than like one big one. Does that make sense? That's the only reason I'm pushing you to open another one.
No, that's totally fine. That makes sense.
But I think it should be done in this. And, you know, we've gotten hung up so much before on, you know, the implementability of features. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end of this meeting. We're trying to adopt Gateway API's kind of method of stable versus experimental release channels, and that should help a lot with this, right? Like if
Yeah.
folks can't implement it, we'll hear from it, but we'll go ahead and get the API out there.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Cool. Okay, anything else on this egress or the first stab at an egress NPEP? I am going to merge it this week if there is no kind of pushback. It does kind of lead me into what I put next on the agenda. We should probably have different NPEP like merge requirements, right? Like I don't think it should just be one approver. The approvers right now in the repo are Dan, Yang, and I. Does anyone here have kind of an opinion on if we should make different NPEP merging requirements? Like we could even require that, you know, a number of approvers and non-approvers, just, you know, contributors approve it. Does anyone have any opinions there?
I
Very
don't.
random.
Okay. The one thing I probably will do for sure is make it that 2 out of 3 approvers have to give it a proven LGTM before it merges. But other than that, I couldn't really think of anything.
But we only have 4 approvers, right?
We only have 3.
Oh, 3. So you
Dan,
want
Yang, and I.
3 approvers, right? So then all of them need to approve every.
I think
There.
all of us having to approve every NPEP is overkill. I think it would slow us down, to be honest.
I mean, maybe we can also add some like LGTMs from contributors or like whoever has reviewed that, maybe, and just have, I don't know, 1 approver and 2 LGTMs from like contributors who also can be approvers, but not necessarily.
Right. I'll at least start with the first, which is 2 out of 3 approvers, but then I'll look into how we could possibly add verification for like a number of non-official +1s, right? Kind of like quorum voting. There's some tools like Mergify that are really cool that I use in other projects where you can apply conditions like that to PR. So I'll take a look at it. I just wanted to soft sound that idea here now that some of these NPEPs are kind of
We should
moving along.
see what Gateway does too, given that we sort of copied the whole idea from them.
Yeah, good point. When in doubt, see what Gateway's done. And at the end of the day, it'll make it easier because I think all of this stuff that we're kind of using that Gateway does will eventually move into its own sort of repository that SIG network subgroups can follow or use. Cool. Okay. In line with all of this, I opened up a draft for implementing stable and experimental API channels. It's not super useful right now because the way Gateway API defines it, at least, is any object that's in alpha is automatically experimental. So everything in our API today is experimental, but I think it could be useful in the future if we, for instance, add a FQDN policy to, or an FQDN selector to admin network policy. We're ready to move admin network policy to beta, but the FQDN selector specifically isn't ready to go to beta, then we can mark it as experimental and still move the entire rest of the API to beta, if that makes sense. So anyway, I'll be working on that more this week. I'll need some reviews, but it should kind of help us out in the long term. And then there's also a concept of extended support resources, I think, that I need to explore within Gateway API, but that's more in relevance to actual like levels of support that the SIG provides. So not exactly sure how it will work here yet.
So quick question there. Would it mean that FQDN probably ends up in extended support, with the idea being that not everyone has to implement it, but some CNI providers find it helpful, so they will? Is that how that'll work?
That's what I was, yeah, I'm probably getting my terms mixed up. That's what I would think, but how that plays into the API channels that we're shipping in each release, I'm not really sure. Like I kind of thought we could overload the channel to mean that, but Shane kind of pointed something out to me earlier in this meeting around also looking at levels of support. So I'm gonna go take a look at that and I'll apply anything I find to this PR.
All right, sounds good. Thanks.
But I'll make it a clear story. Like I'll have some blurb of documentation that explains exactly, like using the FQDN as like a good example. Nadia.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly ask that I think there may be like an optional field of feature, right? So experimental is like the level of its maturity. Well, I think we've discussed, right, that some of the features or fields may actually stay like optional forever, meaning that you don't need to implement that to say that you implement ANP.
Okay.
Right. So maybe FQDN will be one of those.
Yeah, we in the conformance test, so we call them extended features. So there's core features for which we write the conformance, and then anything in the extended means even if you don't implement, it doesn't mean you're not conforming to the API.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Do we have something like that already, or now everything is like required?
No, same labels and not same labels are extended.
But does it say it somewhere?
Yeah, it's in the conformance test, so for which I should probably write the documentation.
Ah, cool.
I will tackle writing that documentation in this PR, Surya. So
thank you, Andrew.
So you don't have to. But yeah, basically we have the mechanism to do so already in our CI infrastructure, but we haven't had a good level of like documentation around it. And again, it's very similar to what Gateway API does. So I'll add that in this PR. Sweet. So yeah, that's coming down the pipe. Should make us a lot easier to kind of, again, like everything we're doing here, all the infrastructure we're doing is so that we can add new things faster without kind of breaking our whole stack in a really solidified way. So really exciting. Cool. Surya?
Oh no, there's still one more item on the agenda, right? I'll go last. Yeah. It's not related.
I think this is just from Nadia for another poke for folks, if they could please check out her NPEP on tenancy. Is there anything else you want to say, Nadia?
Yeah, I actually had a quick question because I created this NPEP as a rework of the existing API, but I wasn't going to add new user stories. So I actually marked its status as, I don't remember how it's called, the next one, which has like the second level, because we already have the user stories defined, right? So then mostly what I was talking about in that is how I wanted to change the API itself. So do you think it's fine, or is it better to like revisit the user stories also first? Because I think there is some confusion in the reviews about what this actually is trying to do.
Yeah, for me at least, when I reviewed it, I didn't quite understand what you just said, which is like you were basically just trying to reanalyze the implementation of the existing user stories, right? I think you need to make it very clear. If you're adding or altering any of the existing user stories, it's going to have to start from the bottom, right? But if you're just trying to reanalyze how the existing ones are implemented, then what you did makes a lot of sense.
Okay, I think I'll leave it like that for now, maybe add some comments in the PR itself, and then we'll see if we actually decide to change the existing user stories. We also need to actually go and find them, because I think the baseline level for tenancy, I'm not sure if there is an explicit user story for that, but it was possible to do. And then that is important to decide on in this potential new API. So yeah, maybe I can try to do both in the same PR. I don't know.
Yeah, I think this story 5 on our website at least was the one around baseline rules. So I know it's kind of a unique intersection of tenancy and this one. Trying to think of the least confusing way to do it, to be honest.
Yeah, I think anyway, just some reviews would be nice, so we can figure out what's the next step. And
Cool.
thanks for all the reviews that you've already provided.
No worries. We'll keep going through it. I think our kind of approach to tenancy was a bit confusing. So Yang already left. I really value Yang's opinion on this. I know he feels strongly, so I'm going to keep prodding him to give more reviews as well. But if there's anyone else on the call who's interested with how we're addressing tenancy with admin network policy, please take a look at this NPEP. Very interesting. Okay, last one, Surya. I'm assuming this is what you had your hand raised about, Cyclonus. Yeah, so for folks who are a bit newer here, Cyclonus, we initially were hoping to use as kind of our conformance test engine, because it had done a lot of great work with truth table based testing. I think it was a bit too heavy-handed for our kind of simple first stab at conformance tests, and now it's just a bunch of code sitting in our repo. I'm inclined to get rid of it if we can't find someone to kind of own the tool and add some documentation around it. I don't know what other folks are thinking, Surya.
Yeah, I mean, I actually also have concerns, like in the sense that we have started this new conformance tests, which is exactly like what Gateway API does, but with all these new NPEPs and new features coming in, maybe the truth table metrics is easier to digest than having individual tests. But having said that, I personally felt that that framework that we added newly was easier than trying to find what was pass and fail in the test grid for different combinations.
Right.
But I could be biased, right? Because I'm the one who wrote the new test. But at least at the very least, I don't know if we have issues on the repo. Like I do, I just wanted to say, like, call out for help kind of a thing, in case anybody on the call is interested in spearheading this.
Yeah, I've actually contributed a bit to the Cyclonus original repo, and my team has found it pretty useful. It has some nice features like dry run and just a nice printout format. So I may be able to take a look at this, maybe see if it'd be useful for us.
Yeah,
thank you so
really
much, Hunter. Yeah, the new tests are in the conformance folder for the ANP, and Cyclonus lives in its own package, I think. So if you are able to find some correlation in trying to, I don't know, collage the two or leverage one for the other in its benefits, that would be awesome. Thank you so much.
Or even if it has, other uses like you had mentioned before, I'm happy to keep tools, any tool related to making the existing network policy API or our new network policy APIs easier to digest and understand. Like, I'm happy to keep any tools related to that here. We just haven't had an owner or an updater for Cyclonus. Like, we don't even have documentation really relating to what Cyclonus does today. So if you were willing just to kind of go in, maybe make an issue or two, start with like very simple things, you know, make sure it works, do instructions for how to run it from our repo. I think that would go a long way to advocate for us to keep it around, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah. Sounds good. I'll start looking into that.
Sweet. Thanks so much, Hunter. That's really awesome. Really appreciate the help. Okay, we are almost at time. I'm pretty much done for today. Does anyone have anything else they want to bring up? Going once, going twice. Sold. Awesome. Well, we're moving right along. Thanks so much, everyone, for your hard work here. And thanks for all the new folks who are kind of hopping on board. Really excited to see where this goes. I hope you all have a good rest of the week, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.